Hello and welcome to a podcast from the Irish Linen Centre and Lisbon Museum. My name is Kieran, I'm the Keeper of Collections at the museum, and I'm joined by Noel Russell, who will be speaking tonight on the topic of his book, The Saved and the Spurned, Northern Ireland, Vienna and the Holocaust. So I suppose to start at the start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name's Noel Russell. I began in journalism as an 18-year-old with the Belfast Telegraph. I worked as a reporter in the East Antrim Times and then the Belfast Telegraph. Then I went to university, and afterwards, after studying in America for a year and doing a master's there, I came back and worked with the Irish News as a reporter and then as news editor. Then I joined the BBC as a radio producer, and I worked in radio current affairs and then in television current affairs on Spotlight. Then I became editor of Speech Radio, and that was sort of non-current affairs programs, in charge of our speech output, basically, apart from news. And then about 10 or 11 years ago, I took voluntary redundancy and pursued my own journalistic interests. And that's how I started on this book, The Saved and the Spurned in Northern Ireland, Vienna and the Holocaust. I'd known about the farm in Malyle, which is where kinder transport children were taken from 1939 onwards. Mm-hmm. But I was reading the Irish News and I came across the daily column, which was written by the late, very great Eamon Phoenix, the historian, on this day. And he described in 1938, hundreds of Jewish people in Vienna started writing to the Ministry of Commerce in Northern Ireland seeking entry to Northern Ireland. People from every walk of life, from distillers, engineers, doctors, even jazz musicians, photographers, seamstresses, owners of firms, owners of factories. And they were pleading desperately to be allowed to come to Northern Ireland. They were pleading because the Germans had invaded Austria in March 1938 and in the Anschluss, and they immediately instituted extreme repression and persecution of the Jewish population of Austria. And then in August 1938, a short item appeared in the only Jewish newspaper that the Germans had allowed to operate in the city. It said that the Northern Ireland government was willing to financially support applications from employers who could create jobs in Northern Ireland. Immediately, hundreds of people applied from Vienna, not just people with their own factories or businesses, but people who were skilled professionals who could train people in Northern Ireland. They were desperately hoping to get in using their background in industry and business and their own skills as foremen and skilled craftsmen and so on. So Eamon Phoenix wrote a note at the bottom of this article on this day, and he said, while hundreds applied, very few were admitted, and it had to be assumed that a number of these people were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. So I knew nothing about this story. I decided to follow up and try and find out more. I went to the Public Records Office where all the letters from these people had been held since the war. And I found out that there were 730 names of people, men, women, largely, some children of families. And they were from every walk of life, as I said, from factory owners to women working on their own for piecemeal rates as people working in the clothing industry, as seamstresses. A small number were admitted and went on to create a lot of jobs here. One factory, for example, opened in Portadown, run by the family called Bloch, and they created over 700 jobs in Portadown. There were other factories opened.
What were they manufacturing?
They were initially making lace for garments, ladies' underwear and ladies' clothing. And that continued employing hundreds of people in Portadown right up until the 1980s when Marks and Spencer's began importing lace from the Far East. And that really sounded the death knell for the Bloch factory. Ulster Ulster Laces, it was called, as far as I remember. So, as I say, I knew about the farm at Malile, which is where the kinder transport children were taken. I knew nothing about this story. Followed up with a scanning and reading every one of the letters. And I found out that I would say between 50 or more people who had experience in Austria as employers or skilled professionals were admitted over a 18-month period between the spring of 38 and the war being declared in September 39. But I also discovered by cross-checking in archives in Vienna that between 125 and 150 of those people who applied to Northern Ireland and who were rejected were murdered in the Holocaust. I was able to find out where they'd been living, when they were deported, where they were deported to, the dates of their deaths, and in some cases the circumstances of their deaths. These people had been transported initially to the east. Some of them were sent right away to the death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, and were killed immediately on arrival. Others had been sent to Theresienstadt, which was a ghetto created by the Germans in Czechoslovakia. And they were held there, some of them for several months, some of them for years. But the place was subject to terrible illnesses, typhus, killed tens of thousands of people. So that was in its own way, while not officially a death camp, it was an extremely dangerous place to be. So I began also trying to contact the families of people who had actually arrived here. And George Bloch, for example, arrived in Northern Ireland in early September 1933. He had got out with his mother and his brother on the last train, as it happened, from Warsaw. His father had already come to the UK because he worked in the clothing industry. And there is a strong link with the linen industry here, because some of those people who were lucky enough to be admitted had a background in linen manufacture in Central Europe. For example, the person who was appointed the manager of the farm at Malile, who got out under the scheme, was a man called Franz Kohner, and his family were linen brokers in a place called Brooks in Czechoslovakia. And we feel that those contacts that the family had built up over the years with the linen industry in Northern Ireland may have helped him get into Northern Ireland. So the linen industry, as it were, was quite important for the small number of people that got in. A lot of the people who got in had backgrounds in clothing. That seemed to be quite attractive for the people at the Ministry of Commerce who were making the decisions on about who got in. So it has to be emphasised at the start that this was not a humanitarian project. Essentially, this was a project to try and counter the extremely high rates of unemployment in Northern Ireland in the late 30s. Northern Ireland, then as now, whenever there was unemployment in the UK or Ireland, Northern Ireland was kind of top of the list as the worst area for unemployment. So the Stormont government was rather desperate to create work here, because in late 38, early 39, the unemployment rate was touching almost 30% male unemployment. So there was a crisis of joblessness here. So to get back to those who came and those who could not come, I interviewed the descendants of some of the small number of people who arrived, and I found out their stories, found out their family stories. I was able to, from the letters in the Public Records Office, I was able to find out the details of everybody who had died after being refused admittance, because there's a documentation archive in Vienna which gives details of the 65,000 people, almost all of them Jewish, who were murdered in the Holocaust. So when I found that out, I was able to tell the stories of those who had applied, some heartrending personal stories of families, some of them with photographs, people basically begging for their lives to escape this extreme persecution. Because when the Nazis had arrived in 1938, they immediately drove people out of their homes and out of their jobs. People were dismissed from employment. They were dismissed from the civil service. They were dismissed from teaching jobs. They lost their factories, their businesses, and they were within a matter of months being forced out of their own homes that were either confiscated from them or that they had to sell at knockdown prices. They were moved into a ghetto called Leopoldstadt in the centre of the city of Vienna, and many of them then had to share small rooms with 3 or 4 other families. The persecution of the Jews in Vienna was really the start of the Holocaust. We tend to think of Poland, quite rightly, as a place where most people were killed in Treblinka and Auschwitz, Sobibor and these other death camps. But the Germans under Adolf Eichmann in Vienna basically developed a template which was used throughout occupied Europe. It basically involves confiscation of property, movement into ghettos, dismissal from jobs, impoverishment, and finally deportation to the east. And the final step then was extermination. So that model was developed within a few months by Eichmann, who was effectively in charge of the entire project in Vienna once the Nazis arrived. He had arrived as a lieutenant in the SS. He was determined to rise through the ranks, and he was determined to do that by persecuting the Jews, because the Nazis wanted to force the Jews out of Austria the way they wanted to do it in Germany. So it was an extremely vicious campaign of persecution against the Jewish population in the city of Vienna, where almost all of the 195,000 Jews in Austria then lived. So
these applications then that came into the Northern Ireland government then, I mean, were they application like forms filled out, or was it letters? Like how did that come about?
They were basic letters. Some of them basically were like CVs, where people gave descriptions of their experience and why they were suitable and how they could create jobs. Some of these people had factories in Austria and outside Austria. They were quite well off. They had access to capital. Others were people who worked as women in the clothing industry, many of them working at home for piece rates. And you had heartrending letters from people saying, you know, my son's already in a concentration camp, has been at a concentration camp for 6 months. I beg you on my knees to try and admit him. He's a skilled worker in the clothing industry. He has experience in working in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Holland. He could train your people. One family wrote about their son, a man called Otto Berman, who was already in Dachau, had been arrested almost immediately after the Anschluss in March 38. Miraculously, he got out after some months after his parents wrote. He survived because after surviving it in Austria, he managed to get to England. He got a visa somewhere or other, but his parents didn't. They were deported to the east and murdered there in the Holocaust. So getting into Northern Ireland, getting a visa to come to Northern Ireland was basically more precious than gold.
It's fascinating. So a CV or an application in some form comes in, and is the correspondence around it discoverable? I mean, do you see are there government memos where officials are saying yes, no? Is there chat about it? Like how does that look?
Well, this is one of the most interesting, in some ways most heartrending part of the story. A small number of civil servants at the Ministry of Commerce, middle ranking, just below permanent secretary level, they had the job of deciding who to let in and who to refuse. Now, obviously, at that time, it didn't seem to be the life or death decision that we now know it was. And on a lot of the letters, there are one of two bits of writing. One is no reply, and the other is regret. No reply, as far as I can see, was an instruction to the typist to not even bother to send a reply. And regret was an instruction to send, I think, a pro forma response saying, "We regret to inform you that your application has been unsuccessful." So there was some interchange between the Ministry of Labour and the Ministry of Commerce about who would be suitable and who wouldn't be suitable, and there was some exchange with the Home Office. You see, the UK government had made it very difficult to get in to the UK, and they decided ultimately who got into Northern Ireland. But if the Ministry of Commerce thought somebody was suitable, they could generally say, "Look, this person will create work here. We want him. He'll be good." And the UK Home Affairs Department would not object. So it was the civil servants at Stormont who really had the key say.
Did they reflect a lot? Like 10, 20, 15, 30 years later, did they reflect, or they're silent?
No, there was silence. There's no indication that there was a sort of a rethinking of what happened. It's frustrating that there's so little internal correspondence from the civil servants. Some of them had been sort of long-standing civil servants even before partition, I reckon, because they were kept on after partition. Some of them got irritated when the most resourceful of the applicants engaged, in one or two cases, solicitors to act on their behalf. For example, if a person got in and wanted to get their parents out, almost immediately it was rejected. But some people who were lucky enough to get in engaged very forceful solicitors to try and get their parents out of Vienna and other places, and the civil servants get rather irritated about this. And the correspondence went on back and forth for months. So to apply, it wasn't a case of just trying to get a visa and, it was a one-off effort. A few people wrote and said, "I wrote a few months ago, we're still desperate, we've heard nothing back. Can we apply again? Please consider our application." We're becoming more desperate, particularly after November 1938, when Kristallnacht happened. A young Polish Jewish refugee in Paris had his parents in no man's land between Germany and Poland when the Germans tried to push the Polish Jews out of Germany, and the Polish government was unwilling to accept them. They were caught in no man's land. And this young man called Herschel Greenspan, he went in with a gun in a moment of despair and shot a junior diplomat, a third-level diplomat, a man called von Rath, in the Paris embassy, the German embassy in Paris. And that immediately was the pretext for the Germans to launch a pogrom throughout Germany and Austria. 30,000 people were taken to concentration camps. At least 90 were murdered, but many historians say several hundred were murdered. And across Germany and Austria, synagogues were burnt to the ground. There were 49 synagogues and prayer meeting places in Vienna. Every one of them was destroyed by fire, apart from one, the main synagogue, which also housed the offices of the Jewish community associations. So it was a huge pogrom against the Jews, and but we have very little internal correspondence. One key figure I should mention in a way is a man called Alfred Neumann. He was a guy who was allowed in, and he was a leading figure on the advisory committee which the Stormont Ministry of Commerce had set up to help the civil servants decide who got in. This
is the Oskar Schindler, isn't it?
He was the Oskar Schindler, because by his own account, he'd got 70 Jews out of Vienna, and by his brother's account, he got 90 out. He opened a factory in Newton Ards in August 1938, just a week or two before the little article had appeared, because he was an export agent in Vienna. He'd come to London in the mid-30s, set up there, and he had contacts in Northern Ireland, which he used to bring out Jews. He brought 6 people to Newton Ards, and they opened a factory in Court Square, and they were making handicrafts, initially soft toys and that sort of thing, belts, gloves later on, and he was a kind of key figure. He advised the civil servants who should be let in and who would do a good job. And, he was a key figure. He also was a co-owner of a factory in Derry, which he opened in November. But within a few months, he had fallen out of favour, tragically. The only evidence we have of this is an Ulster Development Council memo, because they were involved in trying to set up the scheme. Mm-hmm. They said funding had been withdrawn from the Newton Arch factory in early 1939 because of differences between Alfred Neumann and his staff. And I was curious initially to find out what these differences were. And I only discovered after trying various avenues that when he was stood down, as it were, he pleaded to be taken on without success. And then in September 1939, every so-called enemy alien, that's people from Austria, Germany, Poland, in the UK, was registered with a view to possible internment. And one of the first to be interned was Alfred Neumann in December 1939. And he was held initially in a camp in Essex. Then, in the summer of 1940, the British managed to get troops out of Dunkirk. There was mass panic in the UK. It had to be settled because the chances of a German invasion were extremely high. And the British government, particularly Churchill, is alleged to have made the statement, collar the lot, so that huge numbers of Germans, Austrians, Czechs, most of them refugees from Nazi Europe, were rounded up. Alfred Neumann had already been rounded up. These people were taken to internment camps in the Isle of Man after being held just outside Liverpool. In July, after Dunkirk, it was decided, these people could be fifth colonists, we'll ship them to Canada. And Alfred Neumann and 1,200 other refugees were put on a ship called the Arandora Star. It left Liverpool July the 1st, sailed up the Irish Sea, turned west, heading towards Canada. Within a few hours, it was spotted by a German U-boat, U-47. It was captained by a man called Gunther Prehn. He was a fanatical Nazi. He'd already sunk 8 merchant ships in the Atlantic. He had 1 torpedo left, and he was heading home to his home port, Bremerhaven. He spotted the Arandora Star. He fired his last torpedo. It hit amidships, and it sunk the ship with a loss of 800 lives, including Alfred Neumann.
Why did the Northern Ireland authorities fall out of favour? Or why did Newman fall out of favour with the Northern Ireland authorities? Any idea?
We found out more about that when I was able to access the files of Rabbi Jacob Schachter, who was the rabbi. Because Alfred Neumann's brother Julius was a very highly regarded member of the Jewish community in London. He was a senior figure. He appealed directly to the rabbi to do something on Alfred's behalf, and he pointed out that he had got 70 to 90 people out. But the rabbi and the German Jewish Aid Committee in London, they seem to have resented the fact that Alfred Neumann was a bit of a lone wolf. He got people out under his own steam. Jacob Schachter was an extremely active operator on behalf of those who were applying directly to him. He was less sympathetic to those who were, I think in his eyes, treading on his territory, including Alfred Neumann. So it appears from the correspondence with Julius that little had been done by the rabbi to help Alfred get out. In fact, it seems very little. And we know from the correspondence that Alfred himself wrote when he was interned that one of the disagreements that Alfred think happened was disagreements about food. Rabbi Schachter's wife had visited the factory in Newton Arch, and there had been murmurings that they were only getting 1 egg and they really should be getting 2 for breakfast in the morning. Things like this. And the workers, the original 6 workers, actually wrote a letter in support of Neumann on his behalf to the Ministry of Commerce. And and for Julius, and he forwarded it to the Home Office. It made no difference. So it seems that there may have been a bit of sort of turf watching by the rabbi in Belfast and the German Jewish Aid Committee. I think you could say Alfred Neumann was a rough diamond, and he rubbed people up the wrong way. So that's
it's an incredible story, and like what you've done in uncovering this story and telling it is pretty incredible. You seem to have pulled lots of different sources, interviews, government papers, memos, letters to get. I mean, is this a book that could have been written 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or? Well,
the Rabbi Schachter papers only appeared, for example, in recent years. They were at Yad Vashem, and they were under embargo, as far as I was concerned, by a previous PhD student. But I was able finally to get them, not from here, but from the Yad Vashem memoirs, the Yad Vashem archives, where they had been digitized. And I was able to access the correspondence between Alfred Neumann's brother and the rabbi, which opened up, why did this man who'd done so much good end up being interned? I mean, there were two elements. One is panic and sort of hysteria about anybody from Austria or Germany, no matter what they'd done. You know, they thought these people, Churchill and the right-wingers in the UK government thought, well, these people could be a threat. They could be fiscal. It was totally unjustified. It was panic after Dunkirk. But I did want to tell the personal stories. And that's why I made whatever efforts I could to contact the small numbers of relatives who were still alive. So there are other stories in the book about people. I mean, one personal friend of mine, Charlie Warmington, who lives outside Belfast now, his mother, as a young woman, was married to a man called Leopold Kestner. And they were both deported to Poland. Let me get this right now. Charlie's mother was Gertrude Kester. She came to Northern Ireland as a young girl under the Kindertransport scheme. Her parents were Ernestine and Leopold, and they were deported in 1941 to a place in Poland called Modlibrozice. There was a big ghetto there, terrible conditions. Leopold was eventually killed there in some way. We don't exactly know the details. He'd been a member of the Jewish Council in the ghetto, but we think he may have been deported to a death camp from there, probably Treblinka. Ernestine managed with another woman to get away from the ghetto. She managed to get a lift with a guy, a truck driver, and he dumped them at the border with Austria. And they had to make their way, it appears, on foot back to Vienna. And she was able to hide out for 3 years underground in Vienna, protected by a family that she knew who had a photographic studio, and they hid her and got her food. So there were stories like that that were incredible stories of survival. And of course we had people here who formed refugee aid committees. There was a woman called Peggy Lowenthal. After the war, she married a guy who'd been in the French resistance called Egon Fink. Peggy Lowenthal helped to set up a committee which attracted the support of the various churches, and they helped to bring people in. There was a classics professor in Mickey College, a man called Thomas Finnegan, who'd been to Germany before the war, spoke fluent German. He helped to bring people to Derry. So you had all these various strands that started when I started studying the papers in Stormont. I learned more the more research I did, and there's still research to be done, because you pick up stories. I mean, I was in Australia last month and I met Peggy Fink's daughter, Michelle, still alive, and I was able to hear more about her story, and I was able to find out, for example, that there's been a new raft of correspondence between Peggy Fink and her sister, a woman called Mary McNeil was her married name. She wrote a biography of Mary Ann McCracken, but this correspondence between Peggy and Mary started in 1945, and Peggy Fink was discussing what she was doing for refugees after the war, and I'm hoping to access it now at Queen's as part of the special collections. So there are all these strands coming together.
Last question then, have you Have you been able to speak to any family members of those who didn't make it through? You know, the ones who managed to survive, or they avoided going to the concentration camps, or have you been able to touch base with any of them?
Well, I mean, the descendants that I spoke to in Northern Ireland, of course, some of those people came as children, or people like George Block came as a child and opened factories. I spoke to whatever people I could, but of course, those who didn't get out left no trace, because the ones that didn't get out were tended to be killed with their families. And we know most in a way of the ones who were killed. Of the rest who didn't come to Northern and were not killed, it's very hard to track them down, because the Germans kept records of those they killed. Every person sent from Vienna to a death camp, we know what train they were on, we even know what seat they were on, because they kept the passenger list. And the documentation archive in Vienna has been able to find out, you know, with their own researchers, where they lived, what was their last place of residence before they were sent to the east.
Okay, fascinating. Thanks very much, Noel.
Thank you for listening to me, Kieran.